From the book of Exodus, chapter 19, verses 3 to 8. Then Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain and said, "This is what you are to say to the descendants of Jacob, and what you are to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites." So Moses went back and summoned the elders of the people and set before them all the words the Lord had commanded him to speak. The people all responded together, "We will do everything the Lord has said." So Moses brought their answer back to the Lord. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. I'm going to share with you a word. Wayne, can you kick up that word for me? Okay. Anybody know what that word means? It's a phobia. Probably figured that out. It is pronounced, I put it down phonetically. I can't pronounce it either. Epistemophobia. It is the fear of knowledge. The fear of knowledge. Differently, ignorance is bliss, but that's what it means. That ignorance is bliss. And very often we like that idea, don't we? So today and next week I'm going to be talking about covenants, because we are under a covenant with God. But quite honestly, we're kind of ignorant of it. We don't get it. And therefore, we're not held accountable, right? Not so much. I mean, think about this. If you were in another country and you were driving and you broke a traffic law that is not common here in the United States, you'd still be held accountable for it, wouldn't you? Just because you didn't know it doesn't mean you're not held accountable for it. This is the same way, but it's deeper than that. I don't know how many of you read the newsletter that I sent out yesterday, but I started something new this year. I am working on the languages of Hebrew and Greek right now. I'm kind of learning those. The Bible was mainly written in Hebrew and Greek with a little bit of Aramaic. I'm not touching that one just yet, but I wanted to really understand these languages, because if you've looked at English, English is really not a pretty language. It's not a very descriptive language. And so when people took the Bible and brought it into English, even though it makes it easier for us to understand, it loses something. It loses something in the translation. So if you actually look at the words that we use, they're a lot different. The Hebrew word, the term used for covenant, berieth, is from the root word for cutting. Now that may seem kind of odd. Where does that come from? Well, I don't know how much you know about deals or covenants or promises that were made in the Old Testament. But in Genesis chapter 15, it talks about a deal that would be made and how it was committed to each other. They would take an animal. They would, some cattle or a sheep or something like that. And they would cut it in half. And then the two parties would come together in the middle of this really disgusting little grouping here, and in essence shake hands and say that this has been committed, this covenant, this promise has been made in blood. So that's why cutting is where the root word comes from. That's also where we get animal sacrifices and the commitment and the connection. See, the original covenant, as we can see with Moses And the people, I mean, we have the covenant that was made with Abraham beforehand too, which also dealt with animal sacrifice. But this is where it all really comes together. This covenant, this promise, this commitment. It's not just, hey, handshake, verbal. It's more than that. Something dies. It's done in blood. So you have to be really committed to this promise. And the thing is, we're not really, are we? We're not really committed to this covenant, this deal we have with God. God says he's going to watch over us. He's going to care for us. And we agree that we're going to listen to him and follow his commands. There's more to it than that, but that's in essence what it means, right? We have done a really poor job. And I'm not saying this church, I'm saying all churches. If you profess to be a follower of Christ, we've all done a really poor job of it, haven't we? We've really kind of fallen short. And I think one of the reasons is we don't know what it means to commit to something. To really do it. This time of year, what are most people doing? They're creating these New Year's resolutions. And we are now in the 9th day of the year. And how many people have already broken their New Year's resolutions? That promise that they made to themselves or whatever. How many have already broken that? And it was 9 days. To be in this covenant, if you made a covenant when you either were baptized or became a member of this church, you're under this covenant. And so that's a lifelong promise. Lifelong commitment. Lifelong connection. And yet we've kind of failed that. And understand, again, I'm saying we, because I failed too. We all have. We've got work to do. I had a professor one time, and of course, the class I was taking was all about, it was a group of pastors, and he happened to be a pastor as well, and we were talking about, different sermons we've given and different topics that we've discussed, and somebody stood up, and he had this really eloquent sermon that he was talking about. He did, and he was making all these beautiful references and everything. And the professor, after the gentleman sat down, he said, "So what did you ask them to commit to?" And the guy said, "What?" He said, "What did you ask them to commit to?" He said, "Well, I don't know." The professor said, every time you preach, you should ask the people to commit to something. To commit to doing something. You see, every time we show up, our attitude is, every time we show up to do the worship thing, we expect to leave undisturbed. To remain the same person we've always been. To not have to change. We want to feel good without actually having to do anything. And again, I'm in the same boat too. We all have those moments, don't we? We don't want to have to change. We don't want to really have to commit. But we're supposed to, we're called to. When we have a covenant with God, we have to commit to something, to connect with something. But the idea of a promise even, which of course a covenant is even deeper than a promise is kind of lost its meaning anymore. We say promises like when your kids get their Halloween candy. No, honey, I promise I won't eat all your Reese cups. But you do anyways. Now that's a pretty basic promise. And yeah, it gets broken. But then we have promises like a marriage. And what's our divorce rate? A marriage covenant, which it is a covenant, says that you will be together forever. And again, look at our divorce rate. Now, granted, sometimes divorce should happen. Don't get me wrong. But in general, no, it shouldn't. People enter into it with the expectations of having an escape clause, of having plans for if it doesn't work out. And that's really, really sad. We don't take to heart what a promise, what a covenant really means. It takes commitment. It takes a responsibility. You see, in Exodus, it talks about here. He says, go to the people. God's telling Moses, go to the people. Although the whole world is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and holy nations. Obey me fully and keep my covenant. And God would watch over them. He would take care of them. They would be a great nation. I think we're on our fourth covenant with God now. That was number 2. This is, I think, the fourth one. What have we learned? Humans don't do real good with a covenant promise. Now, I'm not saying, how dare they, those stupid idiots, because we're no different. We've dropped the ball too. We don't get it. We have a responsibility. And it goes beyond just a promise, just a business deal, just a handshake. Look at it this way. A person who makes an appointment at a doctor. If that person doesn't show up to the doctor's appointment, in general, the doctor's not going to call you. They're going to charge you a fee because you didn't show up, but that's it. They don't care. That's up to you to connect. If you're a parent and your kid doesn't show up, you don't just write them off, right? At least, please tell me you don't. If a kid doesn't show up, say you have a 16, 17-year-old, and they're supposed to be home from practice by this time, and they told you they would, and they don't show up. No, I'm not talking about my son. He's really good about letting us know. But I'm going to check on him. I'm going to find out where he is. It's a commitment made with blood. We need to go beyond that and be fully and totally committed to this covenant. I talked about it before. We have it really soft here as Christian believers. As Christian believers, we don't have to really struggle a whole heck of a lot to worship, to profess our faith. We don't have a lot to do we? I mean, we can go to Walmart and buy a Bible. We can do all of those things. We should be the most committed of followers of Christ because, in essence, we don't have any restrictions. And yet, we certainly are not. We have other countries where people, and again, I've talked about this before, where people are literally dying for their faith. And I question how many of us would be willing to die for our faith, to have that level of commitment to our connection with God. How many of us would be willing to do that? I got to be honest, I don't know if I would. I'll be completely and totally honest. I would like to say I would, that I would be willing to be that committed, but I don't know because I've never been in that situation. I've never been really challenged. The only challenge I might get nowadays is different interpretations of what the Bible may mean. And believe me, that's not really a big commitment. So how are we committing? How are we committing to this covenant? To this promise that we make? You see, unless commitment is made, there is only promises and hope, but no plans. We can't plan for anything without a commitment. This year, I said I wanted us to work harder on learning our spiritual gifts so that we can truly commit to what we can do as not only a church, but as a community. And we need to commit. We need to make a promise that we'll follow through. And this, I'm not talking about, again, one of those promises where I promise I will work out every single day like we do at New Year's. I'm talking about a real promise, a real commitment, a real covenant like we have with God. Are we willing to do that? I wonder. To kind of help with that, next Sunday, at the end of my sermon, I'm going to have what's called a baptism reaffirmation. What I will have is some little cups of water. One for everybody, however many want to take part in it. And we'll do a baptism reaffirmation. Everything will be up on the screen. It's super easy. But the part that isn't easy is being willing to commit. Because if I see you taking part in that part of the service, I'm going to remember. And I'm going to ask you, what are you going to do to commit? Now, granted, our actions and our words aren't necessarily a level, a way for me to gauge your commitment. The commitment truly comes with your connection with God, but it should affect your outward words and appearance, your actions, your deeds. So are you going to be able to do that? Are you going to be able to take part in that service? If you can't, that's fine. I would honestly prefer you not take part if you can't commit. I want you to be honest. I don't want people to take part in it simply because, well, everybody else is, so I should too. Some of the atrocities of history have come down to, well, everybody else was doing it. And I don't want that to happen. So we're going to commit, and we're going to be serious. And we're going to do something. I don't know what that's going to be yet. Because I think God's maybe waiting on us to commit. Before we do anything, we need to commit. So we can go through those steps. So we can work it out and figure out what God wants us to do. Because God is not done with this church. Some people may look at the numbers that we have and think, oh, well, God's about ready to shut those doors. I don't think he is. I don't think he's ready to shut the doors at all. If these doors shut, I honestly say we got to lay it at our feet. It would be our fault if the door is shut, not God's. So what are we going to do? How are we going to take those steps? It's tough, isn't it? It's not easy. But are you ready to commit? I look at our reading from 1 Peter. 1 Peter, chapter 5. You also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. Can you imagine building a house and one of the bricks, or maybe a couple of the bricks, just decide to quit? That's not going to be a real stable house, is it? it's going to fall down. And that means we got to get it together. And when I say all of us, I don't mean just this church. I mean as a Christian, I don't want to say nation because I don't think we're a Christian nation. But I want to say as a Christian people, followers of Christ, we need to join together. To put all this little argument, stupid stuff off to the side and commit to the one thing that we can all agree on, the gospel of Jesus Christ. We need to commit to that. Commit to it. Build up. Build up into a people that cannot be knocked down. A community that cannot be broken because of our strong connection and commitment to Jesus Christ. Let's bow our heads.